Okay, picture this for a second. You're gripping a thick, heavy rope, and the harder you pull, the more it just cuts right into your hands. Your knuckles are turning white, your muscles are absolutely aching, and yet, somehow, the very thing you're trying to hold on to is still slipping away. Welcome to our explainer on the control paradox. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating psychological phenomenon that affects literally every single one of us, but it's especially critical in leadership settings. So, does having more control actually mean we're safer? To understand this whole paradox, we have to look at the data. There was this fascinating study out of Carnegie Mellon University focused on digital privacy, and it asked a super simple question. Does giving people more control over their personal information actually make them safer? The researchers gave users these highly granular privacy controls, letting them choose exactly how much data they wanted to reveal about themselves. But the results, they were entirely counterintuitive. It turns out the users who were given more control paradoxically took much riskier actions. They actually handed over way more sensitive information to larger, far riskier audiences. What the Carnegie Mellon researchers uncovered here is this really dangerous gap between perception and reality. Giving people all those levers of control basically created an illusory sense of security. Because the users felt so empowered, they completely dropped their guard. The big idea we really need to grasp here is that reaching for control, whether we're talking about our data, our environment, or the teams we lead, creates a false sense of safety. It actually leaves us way more vulnerable to the exact risks we're desperately trying to avoid.
Let's dive into Act 1, the context, generational wisdom, and the urge to manage.
Let's step away from the digital privacy world for a minute and look at how this plays out in our everyday lives, especially for those of us acting as leaders, managers, or parents. Culturally, we tend to associate being in control with being responsible, right? But to reframe this, we're going to turn to the guiding philosophy of Papa, the author of the newsletter that grounds our explainer today. Papa frequently channels this incredible fireside wisdom of his late father, Papa Q. Bear, alongside the really grounded perspective of his spouse, Colonel Debs. You see, they understood something so fundamental. True influence does not come from strict management. It comes from genuine human connection. The quote goes, "The fewer things you control, the more things you actually do control." When you stop trying to micromanage every single variable, you gain mastery over what truly matters, your own thoughts, your reactions, and your relationships. And that brings us to the core definition. The control paradox is this totally counterintuitive reality that grasping too tightly actually diminishes your control and actively harms your outcomes. Think back to that tightening rope from the beginning. If you pull it way too tight, under too much pressure, it's eventually going to snap. It's the same in leadership. When we over-tighten the parameters and try to force compliance, the whole system just breaks down.
Moving right along to Act 2, the tension, the science of safety and stress.
So if control is so incredibly counterproductive, why on earth is it our default setting? Well, according to clinical psychologists, controlling behavior is rarely about actually wanting power over other people. Actually, it's almost always an anxiety response. It's a coping mechanism we use to mask a really deep fear of uncertainty. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at polyvagal theory, which explains how our nervous system navigates safety, danger, and connection. When we feel safe and connected, that's called the ventral vagal state, we're collaborative, we're open, we even unconsciously mirror each other. But when a leader operates from a place of anxiety and attempts to control every tiny detail, they are unintentionally signaling danger to every single nervous system around them.
In a perfect world driven by connection, people feel emotionally safe. But watch what happens when leaders prioritize obedience over that connection. When emotional safety vanishes, the nervous system immediately drops into a sympathetic stress response. And that manifests as frustration, anger, or sometimes just a totally numbed out, compliant withdrawal. Demanding strict obedience without establishing a connection first literally traps your team in a biological state of stress. Imagine a rising tide of complexity, just pushing relentlessly against this incredibly fragile, rigid dam. When adults or managers create these super strict, outside parameters to force compliance, like, say, a teacher banning paperclips altogether just because one student got distracted by them, they skyrocket that stress state. The people we lead start to feel totally unseen. And even worse, we end up pathologizing their completely natural, frustrated reactions to our overbearing control. We blame them for being dysregulated in a disconnected environment that we ourselves created. Which brings us to Act 3, the connection, the Thanksgiving dinner metaphor. Okay, so how do we fix this? Let's connect all this science directly back to our daily lives, using a brilliant, super relatable metaphor from Dr. Greg Bear. I want you to imagine a chaotic kitchen during Thanksgiving dinner. A mother is in there just barking orders at everyone. Carry this, center that. No, don't do it that way. She's holding a scorching hot dish of marshmallow sweet potatoes, and she is utterly furious because she is trying to manage every single tiny detail of the meal. If you asked her how many things she has to control right now, she'd yell, everything. But in reality, her micromanaging is just creating massive friction and resentment. Then an observer gently suggests a little experiment. He says, put the sweet potatoes down, just tell me generally what needs to be done, and let's just see how it turns out. When she finally takes a breath, steps back, and lets people figure it out without correcting their every single move, something magical happens. A natural sense of cooperation and cheerfulness just kind of develops organically. The entire meal gets finished without a single barked order. It's honestly like watching a really tight, tangled knot slowly loosen up into this smooth, flexible, connected thread. Giving up control entirely changes the dynamic. Whether it's in leadership, teaching, or parenting, replacing fear-driven rules with genuine connection is what actually solves the paradox. Because when you give people the space to use their own internal compass, rather than forcing them to obey yours, they naturally step up. Let's wrap up with the synthesis: how to release the grip. So how do we actually do this in the real world? How do we stop gripping that rope so tightly? Well, here are 3 really clear, actionable steps to help ease your grip. Step 1. Identify what control protects you from. Honestly ask yourself, what am I really afraid will happen if I don't step in right now? Naming the fear actually shifts your brain out of threat mode. Step 2. Practice allowing small changes. Let someone on your team do a low-stakes task their own way, just to prove to your brain that the world isn't going to end. And step 3. Set clear boundaries. But remember, a boundary is about what you will do. It is not a hidden rule for managing how others must behave. Let's look at a few more quick, practical tips. Try to notice that feeling of urgency bubbling up, but delay your action. Separate actual safety threats from mere discomfort. I mean, mistakes rarely cause a true disaster, right? They're usually just uncomfortable. Learn to choose good enough instead of absolute perfection. Support your own nervous system with rest and mindfulness. And above absolutely everything else, prioritize the relationship over the outcome. Which brings us to our final Papa-inspired closing thought for today. We spend so much of our energy pulling on that heavy rope, just exhausting ourselves trying to force the world and the people in it to conform to our anxieties. But what the control paradox teaches us is that true, lasting influence only begins when we finally stop pulling. So I want you to ask yourself, if you finally let go of the rope, what new, genuine connections might you build with your empty hands? Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and we will catch you next time.